My husband stood in the hospital hallway, holding our son for exactly 4 minutes, before he handed him back to me and said, "He's not mine. Get a test done or get out of my house." I had just given birth 6 hours earlier. I still had N4 taped to my hand. And the man I had loved for 11 years looked at his own child, a child with his mother's dimple and his father's stubborn chin, and called him a stranger. I didn't cry that night. I want you to remember that, because everything that happened after started with the fact that I didn't cry. I got quiet. And quiet women, the kind who stop crying and start planning, are the most dangerous women in any family. This is the story of how one envelope was supposed to destroy me, and how a second envelope, one nobody was supposed to open that day, destroyed the people who tried. My name is Claire Bennett. Before I tell you what happened in that courtroom, you need to understand the 11 years that came before it, because none of this makes sense without them. I met Daniel Whitfield when I was 24, waiting tables at a hotel restaurant in Boston to pay off my last semester of nursing school. He was 30, already being groomed to take over Whitfield and Sons, his family's construction and real estate empire, the kind of family whose name was on hospital wings and university libraries. He was charming in that quiet, deliberate way rich men learn from watching their fathers negotiate. He didn't chase me. He waited for me to notice him, and then made sure I never stopped. His mother, Vivian Whitfield, noticed me too, from the very first dinner. She had a way of looking at me like I was a stain she was deciding whether to remove or simply live with. Vivian had built her entire identity around the Whitfield bloodline. She spoke about the family the way other people speak about scripture, as something sacred, something that had to be protected from outsiders. And to Vivian, a nurse's daughter from a 2-bedroom house in Dorchester was always going to be an outsider. I married Daniel anyway. I told myself love was enough to outlast his mother's disapproval. For years, it almost was. Daniel was good to me, attentive, generous, the kind of husband who remembered anniversaries without being reminded, who once drove 2 hours in a snowstorm because I mentioned, offhand, that I missed my mother's soup, and he'd tracked down the one deli in the state that still made it her way. That was who Daniel was, underneath the family polish. A man capable of real tenderness when his mother wasn't standing close enough to redirect it. Our wedding itself should have warned me what I was walking into. Vivian insisted on a prenuptial agreement, standard, she said, for families like ours, and buried inside the otherwise unremarkable document was a single clause I barely registered at the time. A provision stating that any children of the marriage would be entitled to their full inheritance rights only upon confirmed and undisputed biological paternity, language our own attorney assured me was boilerplate, common in families with significant estates. I signed it without a second thought. I was 26, in love, and utterly unprepared to imagine that a clause like that could ever be aimed at me specifically. I think about that signature often now, how a single sentence, tucked into 40 pages of legal language, sat dormant for 11 years like a seed waiting for exactly the right season to grow. We tried for a baby for 4 years. For years of appointments, of hormone injections, of holding Daniel's hand in waiting rooms while other women got called in ahead of us. For years of Vivian asking, at every single family dinner, "Any news yet?" Like my body was a business quarter that kept missing projections. There were 2 miscarriages in that stretch, both early, both devastating in the quiet, unspoken way early losses are no funeral, no name, just a silence that filled the house for weeks afterward. Daniel held me through both of them. I want that on the record, because it matters to understanding why what happened later broke me the way it did. The man who cried with me on our bathroom floor after the second loss was the same man who, 3 years later, would look at our living, breathing son and call him a stranger. I have spent a long time trying to reconcile those 2 versions of my husband, and I'm not sure I ever fully will. When I finally got pregnant, I cried in a Walgreens parking lot for 20 minutes before I could drive home to tell him. I remember every detail of that night, the way Daniel picked me up off the kitchen floor when I showed him the test, spinning me in a slow circle while I laughed and cried at the same time, the way he immediately called his father, Robert, first. before even calling his mother, because some instinct in him knew that this particular joy deserved to exist for a few private minutes before Vivian got hold of it and started asking about due dates and nursery colors, and, though I didn't know it yet, quietly recalculating what this baby would mean for the family's carefully guarded bloodline. I want you to hold on to that image, Daniel spinning me around our kitchen, both of us crying with happiness. Because 6 months later, in a hospital hallway, that same pregnancy, the one we had begged for, prayed for, spent our savings chasing, became a weapon aimed directly at my chest. The trouble started 3 weeks before I gave birth, at a dinner I almost didn't attend. Vivian had invited her old friend, Judge Harold Pierce, a family court judge who'd known Daniel since he was in diapers. Over dessert, Harold made an offhand joke about a paternity case he was hearing, something about a husband who should have checked the math 9 months back. Everyone laughed except Daniel, who went very still. Later that night, in the car, Daniel asked me a question that stopped my heart. "Claire, be honest with me. In February, were you really at your sister's the whole weekend?" February. The weekend of my sister Megan's divorce breakdown, when I'd driven 4 hours to sit with her on her kitchen floor while she cried into a bottle of wine. I remember being annoyed that Daniel was even asking, because I had texted him photos that entire weekend, Megan's dog, the takeout containers, the two of us falling asleep on her couch. "Yes," I said. "You know I was. Why are you asking me this?" He didn't answer. He just stared out the window the rest of the drive home. I didn't know it then, but that dinner had been a setup. Vivian had specifically invited Judge Pierce because she wanted to plant a seed, a legal, procedural seed, in Daniel's mind. She knew her son. She knew that once Daniel had a legitimate-sounding reason to doubt something, his lawyer's brain would take over, and doubt would calcify into certainty. What I didn't know, what I wouldn't discover until much later, was that Vivian had already hired a private investigator 4 months earlier. Not because she suspected me of an affair. She didn't. Vivian was far too intelligent to actually believe I'd cheated. She hired the investigator for a completely different reason, one so cold it still makes my stomach turn when I think about it. But we'll get to that. For the rest of that pregnancy, I watched my husband change in small, deniable increments, the kind of shifts you can talk yourself out of noticing because naming them out loud feels paranoid, even cruel. He stopped resting his hand on my stomach the way he used to, an unconscious habit he'd had since the second trimester, feeling for kicks while we watched television in the evenings. He started working later, staying at the office long after Whitfield and Sons had gone quiet for the night. According to the building's security logs, I would only see much later, during discovery. He began asking questions disguised as small talk. Did I remember exactly which weekend in February I'd gone to Megan's? Had I kept the hotel confirmation from a work conference I'd attended alone the previous autumn? Had I ever, in 11 years, given him any reason not to trust me? I answered every question honestly, patiently, telling myself he was simply anxious the way a lot of expectant fathers get anxious in the final stretch. I had seen it before. Working the maternity ward, men who suddenly seem terrified of a responsibility they can't take back once it arrives. I told myself that's all this was. I was wrong. It wasn't fear of fatherhood. It was fear that had been carefully, deliberately cultivated in him by someone who understood exactly which levers to pull. For now, all I knew was that my husband had started looking at my stomach like it belonged to someone else. Our son was born on a Tuesday in March, after 19 hours of labor. I remember the exact moment the nurse placed him on my chest, how he stopped crying the second he heard my heartbeat, like he already knew that sound. Daniel came in an hour later. He'd been in a meeting, an actual business meeting, on the day his son was born, because Vivian had insisted the Millbrook contract couldn't wait. He held the baby for 4 minutes. I remember counting, because something about the way he was holding him felt wrong, stiff, like he was holding a stranger's coat, not his own child. Then he set him gently back in the bassinet, kissed my forehead in a way that felt more like an apology than affection, and said the words that would break my life into a before and an after. "He's not mine. Get a test done or get out of my house." The room went silent except for the monitor beeping my son's heart rate. I looked at Daniel and I did not scream. I did not cry. I said one sentence. You will regret saying that for the rest of your life. He left the room. I found out later he went straight to his mother's house. Here is what nobody tells you about betrayal. It doesn't just take your trust. It takes your energy, your appetite, your sleep, your sense of your own memories. For 2 weeks after I brought my son, I named him Noah, because I needed at least one thing in that hospital to be entirely mine to decide. I existed in a fog. Daniel moved into the guest wing of our house. He barely looked at Noah. Vivian started showing up to help, which really meant sitting in my kitchen, watching me with an expression I can only describe as satisfied. It was Vivian who first mentioned the lawyer. There's a family law attorney downtown, very discreet, handles these matters delicately. Elena Cross. She specializes in paternity disputes and prenuptial enforcement. Daniel's already spoken with her. Prenuptial enforcement. That phrase should have told me everything. Daniel and I didn't have a prenup with any complicated paternity clauses. We'd signed a standard one when we married, drafted by the family's usual attorney. If Vivian was already talking about enforcement, it meant she had been planning something for a long time, something bigger than a simple DNA test. That's when I stopped being numb and started paying attention. I hired my own lawyer, not the Whitfield family's usual counsel, obviously, but a sharp, unassuming woman named Priya Sharma, recommended by a nursing school friend whose own divorce Priya had handled with terrifying precision. When I told Priya what Daniel had said in that hospital hallway, she didn't flinch. She asked one question that changed the direction of everything. Claire, has anyone in Daniel's family had access to your son's medical records or to any biological samples, hair, saliva, anything in the last few months? I thought about it, and then I remembered. 3 weeks before I gave birth, Vivian had insisted on hosting a baby blessing at her house, a small gathering where she'd taken a lock of my hair for a keepsake locket, a family tradition. At the time it seemed sentimental. Now it seemed like evidence collection. Priya's expression didn't change, but she wrote something down and circled it twice. I need to take you back 41 years, because this is where the real story lives. Vivian Whitfield was not always a Whitfield. She married into the family at 22, when the Whitfield business was struggling and her own family owed Boston money, but cash poor, needed the alliance as much as the Whitfields needed her father's connections. Vivian's marriage to Daniel's father, Robert Whitfield, was less a love story and more a merger. For years into that marriage, before Daniel was born, Vivian had an affair. A short one with a young architect who was consulting on the family's first hotel project. She got pregnant. She never told anyone which man was the father, not her husband, not her sister, not a single living soul, for 4 decades. When Daniel was born, Robert Whitfield never questioned it. He had no reason to. He loved his wife, and doubt wasn't part of his nature the way it was part of his son's. Vivian carried that secret for 41 years like a stone in her shoe, a permanent, private discomfort she'd learned to walk around. And here is the twisted, human core of the story. When Vivian saw an opportunity to redirect suspicion, to make paternity somebody else's crisis instead of the secret she'd buried her whole life, some deep, unexamined part of her seized it. It wasn't fully conscious, Priya would later tell me. People rarely calculate their cruelty that cleanly. But Vivian had spent 4 decades terrified of exactly the accusation she now aimed at me, and some poisoned instinct in her decided it was safer to point the finger outward than to ever risk it turning back toward herself. So when Judge Pierce made his careless joke at dinner, Vivian didn't discourage Daniel's doubt. She fed it. She hired the investigator not to find evidence of my affair, because she knew, deep down, there wasn't one, but to build a paper trail that would hold up if Daniel ever tried to cut me out of the family with nothing but a paternity accusation. She needed the accusation to look procedurally legitimate. A DNA test wasn't really about Noah at all. It was about protecting a lie Vivian had been living since before Daniel could walk. The court date arrived on a gray Thursday in June. Daniel's lawyer had pushed hard for an expedited paternity hearing, framing it, cruelly, publicly, as a matter of financial clarity for the Whitfield estate, since Noah's inheritance rights were tied to confirmed paternity. Reporters from the local business press even showed up because the Whitfield name still meant something in Boston real estate circles. Vivian had made sure of that too. Public pressure, she'd calculated, would make me more likely to fold quietly. I sat at the plaintiff's table in a navy blue dress, Noah asleep in his car seat beside Priya's associate, my hands folded so tightly my knuckles had gone white. Across the room, Daniel wouldn't meet my eyes. Vivian sat directly behind him, dressed like she was attending a funeral for a reputation she hadn't yet realized was about to become her own. The court-appointed genetic testing lab representative stood and read the results aloud, the way these things are done, clinical, unemotional, devastating in their plainness. The probability of paternity, based on the genetic markers tested, is 99.997%. The alleged father, Daniel Whitfield, is not excluded as the biological father of the minor child. 99.997%. There was a pause in that courtroom you could have poured concrete into. I watched Daniel's face go through 5 different emotions in 8 seconds, disbelief, then something that looked horribly like relief, and finally, shame, the kind that a person can't hide because it's rearranging their features from the inside out. I should have felt vindicated. And for one breath I did. But I had asked Priya, weeks earlier, to prepare something else, something I hadn't told Daniel or Vivian about, because if I had, they would have found a way to bury it before it ever reached that courtroom. Priya rose from her seat. Your Honor, before this matter is closed, opposing counsel and the Whitfield family should be aware that during discovery, my office subpoenaed communications and records related to a private investigator retained by Vivian Whitfield 11 months ago. We have a second report we'd like to enter into the record. The judge, not Harold Pierce, thankfully, but a woman named Judge Alvarez who had no patience for theater, allowed it. And that is when the second envelope was opened. Priya handed the sealed envelope to the clerk, who passed it to Judge Alvarez. I watched Vivian's face as it was opened, watched the exact moment her composure, 41 years in the making, began to crack at the seams. Inside were 3 things. The first was the private investigator's original report, the one Vivian had commissioned not to find evidence against me, but to establish, in writing, a paper trail suggesting irregularities in the timeline of my pregnancy. A fabricated narrative built from selectively edited surveillance photos taken during my visit to my sister's house in February. The investigator had photographed me getting into a rideshare with a man, my sister's downstairs neighbor, who had kindly given me a lift to a pharmacy because Megan's car had a dead battery. The report never mentioned the pharmacy. It never mentioned that the man was 61 years old and married with grandchildren. It simply implied. The second document was an email chain between Vivian and the investigator, in which she explicitly instructed him, I don't need proof of anything. I need enough ambiguity that Daniel starts asking questions on his own. He'll do the rest. The courtroom had gone utterly silent. Daniel had turned in his chair to stare at his mother the way you'd stare at someone you'd just realized you never actually knew. The third document was the one that changed everything. It was a private genetic ancestry report, obtained through records the investigator had pulled while digging for material against me, the kind of records that get generated almost by accident during a deep background investigation, when financial and medical data overlaps in family trusts. Buried in Whitfield family trust paperwork from years earlier was a paternity clause tied to a life insurance policy Robert Whitfield had taken out on Daniel as an infant, standard for the family's succession planning. As part of the underwriting process decades ago, a genetic marker panel had been run and quietly filed away, never analyzed for paternity, simply for medical history purposes. Priya's team had it cross-referenced. Daniel Whitfield's genetic markers did not match those of his presumed father, Robert Whitfield, at a rate consistent with biological paternity. Vivian Whitfield's 41-year-old secret, the one she thought she had buried so deeply that not even her own son would ever find it, had just been read aloud in open court, by accident, in a case she herself had engineered to destroy someone else's family. I wish I could tell you the courtroom erupted into chaos, the way it does in movies. It didn't. What happened was quieter and somehow worse. Daniel simply put his head down on the table in front of him, his shoulders shaking, and didn't lift it again for almost a full minute. Vivian sat perfectly straight, staring at a point on the wall, her hands folded in her lap like she was still at church. Judge Alvarez, to her credit, handled it with a kind of weary professionalism, reminding the room that the biological question of Robert Whitfield's paternity of Daniel was not before the court and would not be litigated that day, but that the conduct of the investigation against me, commissioned in bad faith to manufacture suspicion where none was warranted, was absolutely relevant to the matter of costs, custody framing, and, she noted pointedly, to Daniel Whitfield's credibility going forward. I didn't say a word through any of it. I didn't need to. For the first time in 11 years, I watched the Whitfield family's carefully constructed hierarchy, Vivian at the top, dispensing judgment on who belonged and who didn't collapse under the weight of its own foundation. Because here is the terrible irony that I understood in that moment, sitting there with my son finally stirring awake in his car seat. Vivian had spent 4 decades punishing everyone around her for a sin only she had committed. She'd made an art form out of deciding who was real family and who was an outsider to be tolerated, all while carrying a secret that would have made her, by her own definition, the biggest outsider in the room. I'm not going to pretend the aftermath was clean or cinematic. Real reckonings rarely are. Daniel came to see me 3 days later. Not at the house. I'd already moved into a rental with Noah, a small 2-bedroom near the hospital where I still worked, close enough to my sister that Megan could watch Noah on my night shifts. He stood on the porch, looking smaller than I'd ever seen him, and asked if we could talk. I let him in, but I want to be clear about something, because this isn't a fairy tale where the wounded husband gets an easy redemption arc just because the truth came out. Daniel apologized. He cried, actually cried, in a way I'd never seen in 11 years of marriage. He told me he'd spent 3 days unable to look at his own reflection, let alone his mother. He asked, quietly, painfully, if there was any way back for us. I told him the truth. I told him that a DNA test had proven Noah was his son, but that no test in the world could undo the 4 minutes he held our newborn like a stranger, or the 2 weeks he made me feel like a liar in my own home while I was bleeding and exhausted and terrified. I told him that trust isn't restored by a lab result. It's rebuilt slowly, if it can be rebuilt at all, and that I wasn't ready to promise him it could. We are, as of the writing of this, in the middle of a careful, cautious rebuilding supervised by an excellent family therapist and by my own unwavering condition that Vivian Whitfield does not get unsupervised access to my son, not now, not ever, regardless of how the rest of this unfolds. Some boundaries aren't up for negotiation, no matter how the family drama resolves itself. Daniel agreed to that condition without a single word of argument, which told me more about how far he'd traveled in 3 days than any apology could have. He also agreed, at Priya's insistence and to his credit without complaint, to a formal, legally binding amendment to our own finances, one that placed a trust for Noah entirely outside of Vivian's reach or influence, controlled jointly by Daniel and me, with a named independent trustee should anything ever happen to either of us. I didn't ask for it out of spite. I asked for it because I had just watched, in real time, exactly how much damage one determined, frightened matriarch could do when a family's money and a family's bloodline were treated as the same sacred thing. I was not going to raise my son inside a system built to weaponize both against him one day, the way it had so nearly been weaponized against me. Vivian, for her part, has not spoken to me since that day in court. I hear from Daniel that she and Robert are in the process of a quiet, dignified, catastrophically expensive divorce, and that Robert, after 41 years, has requested his own genetic testing, separate from any of Daniel's paperwork, simply so he can know, for himself, the truth of the life he built. I've heard, secondhand, that he's taken it with more grace than anyone expected, that his exact words to Daniel were, "You are my son." You have always been my son. A piece of paper from 40 years ago doesn't get a vote in that. I think about that sentence often. It's the same truth I eventually needed Daniel to understand about Noah, delivered by the one member of that family who never needed a courtroom to learn it. Megan, my sister, was the one who sat with me the night after the hearing, once Noah was finally asleep, and asked the question I hadn't let myself ask out loud yet, whether I thought Vivian had ever, even once, felt guilty about what she'd tried to do to me. I told her the truth, that I didn't think guilt was a language Vivian had ever learned fluently. I think Vivian genuinely believed, on some level, that what she was doing was protection rather than cruelty, protecting the family name, the family money, the family's story about itself. It's a particular kind of tragedy, building your whole sense of self around guarding something from a threat that was never external at all. The danger to the Whitfield bloodline was never me. It was sitting at the head of the table the entire time, pouring the wine. I think about Vivian sometimes, more than I expected to. Not with hatred, exactly. Hatred takes energy I'd rather spend on my son. What I feel is something closer to a cold, clear-eyed understanding. She spent her whole life terrified that someone would look at her and see exactly what she was, a woman who had made a human mistake and then built an entire empire of judgment to make sure no one ever looked closely enough to find it. In the end, her own weapon turned in her hand. People ask me now whether I regret marrying into the Whitfield family. I don't, not really, because in the middle of all that ice and inheritance and family pride, I got Noah, and nothing about this story would be worth telling without him at the center of it. I also think, more than I expected to when this all began, about the version of me who sat in that hospital bed 11 months ago, for still taped to her hand, and made a choice in the space of about 4 seconds. I could have screamed. I could have called my sister and cried until dawn. I could have signed whatever document Daniel's lawyer put in front of me just to make the humiliation stop faster. Instead, I went quiet, and I went precise, and I trusted that if I simply refused to let anyone rush me into a decision, the truth would eventually have nowhere left to hide. That, more than anything, is what I want the women listening to this to take with them. Not the details of the Whitfield family's 41-year-old secret, or the specific mechanics of a courtroom in downtown Boston. The lesson is smaller than that, and it travels further. When someone you love accuses you of something you didn't do, your first instinct might be to prove your innocence as loudly and as fast as you possibly can. Resist that instinct. Slow down. Document everything. Ask for the second envelope, especially when nobody else in the room wants it opened. The people who are most desperate for you to move quickly are very often the people with the most to lose once the full picture finally comes into view. But if you're listening to this, and you recognize even a piece of yourself in it, if someone in your life has ever tried to make you the villain of a story to keep you from finding out you were never the one who did anything wrong, I want you to remember what I told Daniel in that hospital hallway, before I even understood how true it would become. You will regret saying that for the rest of your life. Sometimes the truth doesn't come out because you fight loud enough. Sometimes it comes out because you stay quiet, stay steady, and let the people who lied simply run out of room to keep lying. I got my son. I got my name back. And somewhere in a lawyer's office in downtown Boston, there's a second envelope that proved something Vivian Whitfield spent 41 years making sure no one would ever open. She should have remembered, the truth doesn't ask permission. It just waits for the right envelope.